Welcome to A Conversation with History. I'm Harry Kreisler of the Institute of International Studies. Our distinguished guest today is Jeremy Kinsman, who is ambassador in residence at Princeton University. For more than 40 years, he served the Canadian Foreign Service, serving at posts in Washington and as Canada's ambassador to countries as different as Russia, to Great Britain, to the European Union. He's working at Princeton on a project on democratization. Jeremy, welcome to Berkeley.
Oh, thanks. It's welcome back, actually, Harry.
Yes, and you were on our program more than 2 decades ago.
Younger.
Yes.
Not more idealistic guy then than now.
Yeah. And probably wiser, or maybe you were already wise.
I've been beaten up a bit, so that makes you wise. You get some scar tissue.
Let's talk about your background. Where were you born and raised?
I'm a Montrealer.
Mm-hmm. And looking back, how do you think your parents shaped your thinking about the world?
Directly. My mother was an American, actually born in California. Though her family was from West Texas, and her grandfather ran the railways in Mexico. So when the revolution came in 1911, he was one of the first guys that they wanted to get, and the family scurried north to Brownsville, crossed the river. They did get him, and they put him in a slammer in Matamoros for a year or two, till the American government got out. My mother, her father had died, and my mother then married an American who lived in Cuba. So my mother grew up in Cuba, and unfortunately her mother died. And at the age of 21, she came into a small legacy, and she went off to Paris to be a painter. Met my father, who was Welsh, a student in Paris. They lived in Paris, where my brother and sister were born, and then the war came, and willy-nilly they ended up in Canada, and I got born. But I think somehow my coding came out of that internationalism, and particularly my affection for Europe.
And was there a lot of discussion around the dinner table about international affairs, or was this did you get hooked on this beyond what you've just described in school?
Yes, yes, there was a lot of discussion about international affairs. This is the 50s. And absolutely. And when I went to college in the United States, it was John Kennedy, and it was serving causes, Peace Corps, and I sort of did what I calculated was the rough Canadian equivalent, which was joining the Foreign Service.
And where were you? Where did you do your undergraduate work?
Princeton.
Princeton. So you came back to the United States.
Well, I hadn't been in the United States, but skipping a generation, I came back to the United States.
Right, right. And what did you major in Princeton?
I started off in sort of politics and stuff, and then a professor, misled by the fact that I had had a rather classic English post-secondary education with a lot of Shakespeare. He taught Shakespeare, and I had by rote learned my Shakespeare. He thought I was really bright, and so he persuaded me to be an English major on the basis that I could learn politics from the New York Times, but studying English literature, the novel, I would learn analysis of a different kind and articulation of analysis. And you know, it wasn't bad reasoning. I had to go get another degree later to get a job, but that being said, I stand by his advice.
It seems sometimes that when the world falls apart, and we've gone through some recent experiences in that regard, that a return to literature and the great books is helpful.
It's helpful. It's helpful, Harry. And a friend of mine, Ray Bonner, who's a fine investigative journalist, a long time with the New York Times, just wrote a review essay in the American Interest on exactly this, that fiction can sometimes cut to the imponderable. He was writing about 3 novels about suicide bombers, which is an unfathomable act to us. And I could tell you what they are. Perhaps your viewers would want this as a book reference. But one was The Attack, the other one's The Reluctant Fundamentalist, and the third is The Amateur Spy. That fiction was able to approximate the process of reasoning and motivation much better than any of the staff analyses of this stuff that's out there. And I think fiction does have that edge, yes.
And you did some graduate work?
I did subsequent university work. I went to law school for 2 days and in Canada.
I've heard
realized,
that before,
that this wasn't what I was going to do. And so then I went off to, I'll call it whimsically, law school in Paris, the Faculté de Droit. But I mean, that isn't exactly, the thing either, with 600 students in a class and Napoleonic Code. And then I went to the Institut d'études politiques, known colloquially as the Sciences Po, and got a degree there, yes.
And you went right into the Foreign Service?
No, I didn't, for family reasons. My father died and stuff, and I went and worked for the multinational company, Alcan, that he had been associated with for a year to help bridge, and then I went into the Foreign Service, yeah.
So what are the skills, would you say, that are required to be an effective diplomat?
Different today than then. Let me tell you that the vocation, profession, practice is vastly more public today than it was then. The notion of diplomats being accredited just to a government, sent by a government, working discreetly with government officials in that narrow band of discussion is replaced by diplomats representing a much wider swath of their own society and helping to convene, broker, connect civil society to civil society. They connect in a country to civil society. They do public diplomacy. There's an awful lot of projecting your own country. It's a quite different profession, and it's not any longer, although this is conflictual, as thoroughly directed in a sense of the individual by headquarters as it used to be. I mean, there's a lot of autonomy in terms of developing the motif of what you're doing and how you're able to help.
And so what if students were watching this, what are the skills involved? I guess language is very important.
Well, it is essential. That's a skill that the institution has to equip the person with. It really is now unpardonable that you go to a country and work, as I'm describing it, particularly out there, without speaking the language. Now, I mean, there are some very difficult languages, and you can't expect that, but if you're going to send people to China, they really do have to speak Chinese. So language, but language should be something that you are equipped with as part of your toolbox when you go. I think self-starting, I think you have to be a person who wants to get out of the office. You have to be a street person to some extent, because that's what it's about. There are too many people emailing each other, you know. Unfortunately, governance, has become so riddled by admin. I guess it's true in universities too, but surveillance and stuff. There's an awful lot of meeting about stuff that really isn't part of the substance because of accountability and the use of money. But I think personability is still terribly important. Creativity is important.
And also, you must...
And something else.
Please.
that I've recently become quite exposed to cultural anthropologists.
Yeah.
And I'm fascinated to find out that the U.S. military is now using cultural anthropologists in training of officers, partly because people got to Iraq and they realized they couldn't connect or relate to the population. You have to have a curiosity, the intuitions of a cultural anthropologist, and increasingly, I think, some of the technique to do cross-cultural stuff, because that's really what you want to do. A sad thing, I may say, to me, observing, I'm not an American, is how unfortunately restricted American diplomats in the field have had to become because of the security issues. And it's very difficult for them to be in the souk, as it were, as freely as they would like to be.
And this sounds like it's an advantage that a country like Canada has, because its eyes and ears can be more along the line of what Lyndon Johnson used to call pressing the flesh. I mean, going out and talking to people and going to places that satellites and formal visits can't give you that kind of information.
I think it does give you, to some extent, an interpretative edge. Also because you come to a country with less importance behind you of your country's position, and maybe a little less baggage to some extent in terms of strength of identity. I'm not diminishing the Canadian sense of self, but it isn't as robust in terms of the global role as the American.
What about the negotiating part of being a diplomat? Talk a little about that. You quoted Brahimi in your lecture as saying he came to Iraq to negotiate for the Secretary General after de Mello's murder, and went around to the different groups and, well, what is the minimum you wanted? Talk a little about that. That's
a specific form of negotiation. That's mediation, conflict mediation, which is becoming, to some extent, sort of an art form that's actually taught. I think Brahimi was uniquely positioned to be a cross-cultural figure himself, being sort of a secular Algerian I wouldn't say pseudo-Muslim, that's not perhaps polite to him, but he wasn't identified with any sect. And he was able to talk to the different factions, sectarian in Iraq, Sunnis, Shia, and all the different subdivisions. And his purpose was to determine the minimum requirements of each. And in that kind of mediation, you have to be able to represent the kind of good faith to the different parties that would enable them to speak to you roughly frankly. And his view, and I think it's a valid view, is that everybody has minimum requirements. A lot of the situations in Africa have gone the same way. The other kind of negotiation is a direct state-to-state negotiation. That's a different kettle of fish, and there are different ways that people do it. There's a Russian way in which you're tough and you bang the table, some Russians, and there are other ways. Very often, I've noticed, in an effective way, is you deploy people who are rather similar to the people you're negotiating with. I'm amazed that French ambassadors to Washington these days are utterly un-French like guys. Yeah. They're very, not that the French aren't sweet, but these are sweet, personable, patient, gentle, understanding, listening people. And it's actually very disarming and effective because it's unexpected. And in negotiation, doing the unexpected can sometimes be very effective.
And what about that, your relationships and whatever your posting is with other ambassadors from other country? How important is that set of exchange in terms of confirming the information that you've gathered and so on?
Well, it depends very much on the situation.
Yeah.
In stressed situations, if you take Myanmar or Burma today, the embassies, democratic embassies, who are represented there, because there aren't all that many, are in close contact with each other. In other stressed, changing situations, I think of Belgrade during the revolution to get rid of Milosevic, that embassies and NGOs were working together, not just to exchange information in a fast-moving situation, but also to some extent to coordinate what they were doing in terms of relations with civil society, so that there wasn't a double emploi, or there weren't vast areas that were being neglected. If it's Washington and you're an embassy, it's pretty much sink or swim on your own. You're not, the Canadians aren't talking to the French to get their views about what's going on in Foggy Bottom or the NSC. I mean, people are pretty much doing their own thing. Of course, some countries like the European Union have an institutionalized lateral exchange, as do, by the way, some poor countries. Africans will, because they're small, try to benefit from each other's stuff. So it varies. And it varies according to function. On terrorism, counterterrorism, for example, professionals are interacting all the time.
Your mention of NGOs, that is a big change from the beginning of your career till later. And we're talking here about NGOs both from your own country, Canada, but that are represented in whatever posting you have, but also the NGOs that are indigenous to wherever you are.
Absolutely. NGOs barely existed when I started.
Yeah.
And today they are partners, they're partners, shall we say, in purpose, but not in method. And there is, to some extent, a certain, if not arm's length, relationship that has to be respected. It's a hand's length relationship. Human Rights Watch, for example, makes a point of never taking money from governments. And they speak for themselves. We may, as human rights defenders, have the same view and interests, and particularly vis-a-vis a specific case, and we may work together, but it's very clear they are not attached to any particular government.
Now, you have a lot of autonomy, and you've helped us understand that, but you are the representative of Canada. And so I'm curious about what that meant, not on specific issues, but generally Canada's role in the world. Help us understand that Canada is a middle-rank power. It's seen in the world as favoring multilateralism. Its foreign policy, as an outside observer, I would say, it reflects a greater idealism, and so on. So how does that impact who you are as an ambassador?
I'm going to say I'm not sure all those things are still true. The present government, and I'll just state it objectively, is not as instinctively reliant on multilateralism as predecessors. It came into office 3 years ago with very little foreign experience in its ranks, and I think it had a sort of a view that what had been a tradition or a continuum over time that you described was something that they were going to rethink. And so they're not exactly there. Canadians, however, are there. And so I think it will bring them there too, because that's in the nature of electoral politics. As a Canadian, you're much more mobile than, say, an American diplomat, but of course you have less influence. You are operating globally in every continent. Canada has important relationships in every part of the world. But you're doing so without a hard power platform. I mean, the United States is unique in the world. It spends half of the world's military expenditure is American. It not just is in volume, it's in the enormous quantum superiority in quality, electronically and otherwise, 11 carrier groups and stuff. When you have that at your back, it's actually very different. I'm not saying that the average American diplomat goes out and is conscious of the carrier groups, but it differentiates the United States. Canada is known, it doesn't have historical burdens subject to misinterpretation. And so there is, again, that word flexibility, openness, and access, I think. We've had strong aid programs. They've been stronger than they are now, and they should be stronger again. And people make a difference. Trudeau made a big difference in the 15 years or so that he was running Canada.
You said in something that I read, I don't remember if it was in the lecture, everything, of course, is in the timing. In foreign policy, if you're not a great power, what you achieve is really going to be very great. But your reach should exceed your grasp, or what is heaven for, you said. Talk a little about that, because the suggestion here is there's a kind of a greater place for idealism, basically for maybe not having the power to move things along, but maybe as a presence with ideas to do that.
Well, I think it applies very much to American potential today.
Yeah.
I think that's Wordsworth. Your reach should exceed your grasp,
okay.
for what's a heaven for. Talking about President-elect Obama, and everybody is, and I have no privilege or prescience, but just to say that I'm very convinced that there is a unique opportunity now in favor of his persuasive abilities to alter things. And because the examples he wants to provide are going to be contrary to the examples that people have seen in the last several years. He has said that he is willing to contemplate a certain shaving of American sovereignty in favor of the international community collectively on peace and security issues, if that is going to promise effectiveness. And in terms of reach exceeding grasp, I'm fascinated by this initiative in which George Shultz is a major protagonist, along with Dick Lugar and others, for the elimination of nuclear weapons, which used to be seen as an impossible sort of ideal, going back to Bernard Baruch, but is now live again. It does two things. It's a statement of bona fides that the United States is willing itself, if not to go down to zero, to cut. And if you're going to argue against proliferation, that double standard message is extremely important. And secondly, it's a perfect example of your reach actually literally exceeding your grasp. But it is a very, very strong motivator. And in something as complicated as that, where there are so many technical challenges and obstacles, having such a motivator to get past those is important.
But Canada is also a place, not necessarily in this area of nuclear weapons, but in others, where new ideas can be broached. I'm curious about how that tends to happen through diplomacy. And is it all just about power? I mean, as a Canadian ambassador, you're listened to, though, although you may not have the power of the U.S.
Well, you're listened to. I mean, you can't brand anything inauthentically. That's a fact. And you're listened to as much as your ability to show activity which is supportive of the other person or view demonstrates. And we had a very good run on the issues surrounding human security, going back to, I'm going to say, the late 90s, when on the International Criminal Court, on the anti-personnel landmine issues, in which we had a foreign minister of extraordinary energy, conviction, and determination.
And that was
Lloyd Axworthy, to do it, and to form coalitions with NGOs against the fixed interests of the larger powers. And he did that very successfully. I can think of other examples, and today, by the way, we are way committed in Afghanistan around Kandahar, as you probably know, and we've lost 100 Canadians. And people are going back for their third or fourth dangerous tour, including aid workers and diplomats. That is a direct demonstration of bona fides. Other countries do it too. You know, Norway has made a specialty of picking up the Oslo process in the Middle East. They have become very involved in now in trying to mediate the problems of Sri Lanka. And those things are real. They're not just rhetoric. And you have to show that reality and sense of purpose. You can't lose it. So we've had it at different times. We used to have it in terms of participants in peacekeeping. Peacekeeping has changed over the years. And now there is a different sort of version, a more robust version with robust mandates. It's almost peacemaking. We're very identified and have been with the responsibility to protect, I'll call them theories in a way, which emerged after the shameful disasters of Rwanda and then Srebrenica, and articulating that. Of course, that theory or set of principles is only as good as practice is going to be, and what has not happened in Darfur is kind of discouraging. Though that's not a particular Canadian failure, though we did, under the last government, commit ourselves very strongly to doing something in Darfur, and it turned out to be more complicated than anticipated.
You said that your career started influenced by the idealism of Kennedy, and the US-Canadian relationship is a very important one, especially for Canada. What has happened, in your view, to that relationship over time? Is there a general way, without getting into specifics, that you can characterize how it has evolved during the period of your career?
Well, you said it all. It's a very important relationship, especially for Canada. That's the issue. Selling the relevance of Canada to the United States, to Americans, has always really been an uphill struggle. Today, I think it's perhaps less of an uphill struggle in the sense of energy requirements, provided that we are not seen as being offenders with our carbon footprint in terms of the way we get the energy out of the great tar sands. I think there is a value, Harry, in a continental approach to many things, which is why we have NAFTA with Mexico. Canada has always had a fear that continentalism integrates our country into the social assumptions that inherently are part of the American political fabric, which wouldn't be adequate to Canadians. As you know, we have public health care, free at the point of use, a universal system. We have a variety of other social instruments that the United States does not have, that Canadians would fear would be at risk in a more integrated economy. It turned out that wasn't true. You know, it's very simple. And as NAFTA and the European Union become economically more and more integrated, it becomes very pertinent to the discussion with the Europeans that just because you're integrating productive facilities and cross-investment doesn't mean you have to integrate social policy. You simply tax yourselves differently. And by and large, Canadians have been more in favor of higher personal taxation, provided there is a corresponding return in essential social services. And the fundamentals are health and education and infrastructure as a reward than American jurisdictions have been. And so you don't have to integrate your tax codes at all, though probably you do have to integrate your corporate tax codes because you need a level playing field. So I think that evolution has gone on, and it's given Canadians greater self-confidence in the workability of the Canadian model in a more integrated North American economy.
And so what you're saying is that Canada has been able to preserve its identity national and cultural in the context of building a stronger relationship with the U.S. As part of the globalization processes that are going on in the world. Is that a fair?
Yes, I think so. By stronger relationship with the U.S., I mean a more integrated, just-in-time supply chain between the two economies. I wouldn't go so far as to say that we have a stronger relationship government to government with the U.S. I think actually it's rather weaker than in some other decades that I've known it. So it doesn't go hand in hand. Let's hope that it will become stronger again. What is happening that's interesting, since I'm sitting here in the state of California, is a much stronger relationship between sub-federal jurisdictions. And Schwarzenegger, California, on ecological issues is not just a partner with British Columbia and some other provinces on devising a workable cap and trade system on the big issue of climate change. It's a world leader. And so there's America and there's America. So it's all going on. On the cultural issues, some of the febrile insecurities of the 80s, I think have been to some extent assuaged by the fact that cultural industries, which are a preoccupation only of English Canada, because French Canada is a self-sufficient cultural marketplace, if you want, with its own star system and audience, and it works. English Canada has always been much more vulnerable to mass market American popular media. I think there's been a certain regain of self-confidence, and our writers have done a lot for that. I mean, writing has flourished, partly because we've kept alive Canadian publishers who will be the ones who will publish Canadian writers. I mean, American publishers will publish Margaret Atwood's fourth book once she's a successful star, but it's who publishes the first book that you need somebody who's going to nurture your own culture for.
You were in the embassy in Washington early in your career. You've been an observer of America, I'm sure, in all of your postings. How do you account for, we had a recent guest, Herbert York, on our program. He referred to the recent period as the dark ages of American foreign policy. I'm not asking you necessarily to agree with that, but I guess the question is, if you were reporting either as an ambassador or as a journalist, which you're now writing columns, how would you characterize the way America changed in the course of your career, beginning with your experience as a student when JFK was a model to the world? Of course, now we've ended up with Obama, but there have been things in between.
Well, there's been the war in Vietnam.
Yeah.
And then 9/11. And there's been the end of the Cold War. When I was a student in the early 60s, as you were, I think my class, my graduating class of 1963, was the last class to graduate in a state of hopeful innocence, highly energized by the Kennedy message, highly energized by the progress on civil rights, which was all around us. Even though the university I went to, Princeton, in the early 1960s was not integrated. I mean, there were a few black guys. It was all boys then. And it became so 10 years later, enormous.
You mean white boys and very few blacks?
Like two, three.
Yeah.
One of whom was an African prince, you know. Really astonishing, and that was the early 60s. But let me get back to my point. We were the last class, I think, to graduate in a state of innocence, because that fall he was killed. And I think our successor class emerged under a darker cloud, and then what we know happened. And I wouldn't overdo this, but I would say that I recognize on campus today some of the spirit but maybe a little wiser among undergraduates that we felt in the early 60s. Things are cyclical, and events drive things, and 9/11 drove a tremendous amount of psychology and trauma, which became institutionalized and inhabited American policy and drove it. And as you said, I'm not going to comment on the Dark Ages. I mean, but read the book Angler on Vice President Cheney, and you can see where these guys were coming from. And they were coming from a different place than anybody else was coming from. I think that's the point. And
even within the American system.
I would say even within the administration.
Yeah.
And that isn't all out yet. But others were trying to understand that and empathizing with some of the trauma involved. But for some, it appears, the trauma was a useful vehicle for pursuing interests which they'd identified earlier of propelling the United States of America into a position of unassailable superiority, believing it was the exceptional country and that superiority would be safe in their hands, not in anybody else's. That is a view that really gets in the craw of other people in the world, and even friends of America, of whom there are many. And I think that form of exceptionalism is that Madeleine Albright also proclaimed is gone with this administration because of the fact that Barack Obama doesn't have to declaim America's exceptionalism. His election shows Americans' exceptionalism, because everywhere I went in Europe this fall, talking to people, Britain, France, Spain, Italy, they expressed skepticism, though they supported him and hoped for him, that America at the end of the day would elect him. And it wasn't because they had a dark view of what Americans would do in a polling booth. It's because they basically were saying it couldn't happen here. And it did happen in the United States. And I go back to my earlier point. That is an opportunity of influence leading to persuasion that is quite unique and is a return to an American position of influence that I think possibly has not existed since Kennedy. Okay, I don't think since Kennedy has it existed, because Reagan had vast projection, and particularly, of course, in Eastern Europe, but he was contested on other levels. So we'll see where it goes.
Now, one of the concepts that is partially was abused. Let's put it this way: was abused by this Bush administration, was the idea of democratization, marrying it to the point of a gun. And I know you've been working recently on, this is a real issue that continues to go forward, and we have to think about, but one that has to be disassociated from this recent period of abuse by American policy in Iraq, where that was latched onto when everything else was unraveling.
George W. Bush, spoke often of the freedom agenda, to which a Democrat should have no objection in terms of his aspiration for Democrats' aspirations elsewhere. It was, sadly, I think, the use of that argumentation in Iraq after WMD and connection to 9/11 came up dry. So we're doing it to bring these people democracy. That, in effect, has scared off a lot of people in the world, including Americans. It's controversial. When I came across the border, one of the first times I was coming in to be at Princeton last year with papers, I came to a quite tough, though impressive, African-American Homeland Security border person who had just given a guy before me hell and sent him off to secondary, and I was quite meek, and she said,
diplomatic.
Yeah, well, she stared me down and said, "Well, what are you coming here for?" And I tried to explain that I'm coming to do a project of democracy support. What do you mean democracy support? And I said, well, there are lots of countries, 40% of the world, ma'am, who live in authoritarian, repressive situations, and it's a question of how do you help putative Democrats. And she said, wait a minute, just a sec. She said, haven't we stuck our nose enough in other people's business? Haven't we done enough damage? Well, I mean, that is out there because of the last few years. But if people stand back and take a look, particularly take a look at some of the wonderful documentary films that Steve York has done, A Force More Powerful, and others, about nonviolent conflict, going back to freedom riding in the United States and boycotts and other things in the South, and the Elizabethtown boycotts in South Africa, and the way the Chilean people brought down Pinochet. It becomes apparent that what happens in a country in terms of favoring democracy depends on the people in the country. Mm-hmm. And each situation is different. No two situations are the same, and what happens depends on the culture in that country. But that violence doesn't work. Mm-hmm. Historically, repressive regimes can always out-violent dissidents using violence, and in the process totally alienate and scare away the bulk of the population that has to. So violence doesn't work, and things generally are bottom-up, and so our obligation as democracies is to observe the right to help and the rights of people in countries to be helped, to try to nurture civil society in these countries, bearing in mind, Harry, something, which is obvious, but it's not obvious sometimes till you go there. As a lot of the kids, graduate students I was working with, were doing all the time, shooting off to Laos for a weekend. But today, because of the information revolution globally, people in the most remote corners know what the norms are elsewhere, okay? It's not a mystery. Even in situations where you're not allowed to get on the internet, people in Burma know what the rights are that are applicable elsewhere. And by and large, in most countries, except in the extreme ones, where connections are forbidden or there are firewalls, they're in touch. They're in touch. And so this is a force, it is a force more powerful. It's a force more powerful than anybody, or Robert Mugabe, or the Burmese junta, at the end of the day.
Democratization and democracy.
Yeah. Democratization, not according to our template, but according to what emerges. And it's not just about elections. It's about after elections. Mm-hmm. And it's about generosity to opponents and to pluralities, to minorities, inclusiveness. And that's why this guy, who's all about inclusiveness,
Obama,
is this shot of adrenaline to human rights defenders and democratic activists the world over. So hang on. I think it's going to be interesting.
Let's try to bring a couple of things together here. I know that in your talk you expressed a lot of frustration with the American response to the situation in Georgia when a war broke out there, and it was a situation where, in a way, one could say that Cold War ideas were in play. Let's keep NATO going. Let's bring everybody in as a kind of prelude to that crisis. On the other hand, we're in a situation now where an economic crisis is going to lead to the opportunity to establish new rules, first maybe in the economy and then maybe elsewhere, about that reflect the new centers of power. And this is going to be an enormous challenge to leadership, to move from using old ideas to moving to a change situation where there's going to have to be less of the U.S. telling everybody what they should do, and more of this kind of multilateral idea that in an earlier period, you know, sort of what Canada was about in its foreign policy. Talk about, do you see what the key challenges are going to be in moving to these global agenda issues, you know, transnational issues that you've worked on in the past, that to come up with kind of multilateral solutions in a new way?
Yeah, let's put the Georgia-Russia thing aside.
Yeah,
I think the applicability of that is that American media bought a line from a guy who had been educated in America and spoke fluent English and was spinning.
Yeah, the president of Georgia.
Yeah, Saakashvili he boasted at BBC, gave 1,100 interviews. The real war was the public relations war, and who was responsible for that. I think there's a self-correction now going on. So put that aside. What the Russians did was excessive in response, but it's Saakashvili who started this on August 7th. But going back to your question, what is interesting about that is that the United States media, it's a 24/7 news cycle, and you know, there's not a lot of time for too much reflection. They will go to the source that they relate to most easily in the first instance. And I think that what has happened, I heard Henry Paulson, Secretary of the Treasury, use the phrase, I think, humility 3 or 4 times after the frankly disaster of what has happened in Wall Street, about methods and models. We, in the international financial and probably trade worlds, have been just repeating a mantra of free markets for so long now, and deregulation.
Coming from the U.S. I mean,
absolutely, coming from the U.S. It's always been called the Washington Consensus, and very represented by the international financial institutions, the World Bank and the Monetary Fund, and very much, I'm going to say, rather condescending. For example, Europeans to get their tax codes down, and that's what it was all about. And that, I'm afraid, Sarkozy may be overdoing it. There may be a bit of schadenfreude in that by saying it shows, and certainly, of course, the statements by Medvedev and even the Chinese, that the American model has been exposed as being, not quite the success that it had been touted to be, but there is something there that actually is permitting top Americans to rethink a few assumptions, but not going. I don't think anybody wise should be going for any kind of a global dirigism or a college of supervisors of banking probity and something internationally is probably right, because the most globalized form of economic transaction exactly is in finance, in the way capital moves, and fast. And so perhaps that's right. Absolutely that India, China, Brazil, and Russia deserve a place, not just at the table. They want something else. They want downstream participation in our economies. And people have been loath to concede that, particularly to Russia, worried about oligarchs, and to China, because some of the money behind China investment actually is military, and getting that into our natural resources. People and don't forget the scandal about. Was it Dubai and taking over a port authority in the United States? There's some reticence we're going to have to get past. In terms of power sharing, decision making, yeah, sure. Forget about the G8. I think it's over. We're going to have some enlarged forum of consultation, some G20 or something. And I think this is consonant with, again, Obama's approach as being an inclusive, big tent sort of guy,
Over the years of your career, you have been exposed, dealt with, worked with an array of kind of international leaders. And very briefly, I'm going to tick off some names and give me your first insight, not necessarily a detailed, complex analysis, but Trudeau was an important figure in Canada during your time as an ambassador. What is your impression of what made him a more than ordinary leader?
Depth of perception. I think that he is probably different from all the others you're going to mention, in the sense that I did work with him and I wrote speeches for him and liked him enormously, and he inspired me. But and he did a great deal for Canada. He was a man steeped in human rights. And in this issue of power sharing, by the way, it was a phrase he coined back in 1979, 1980. And I would say Trudeau, for those reasons, for a globalized view, north-south, of those responsibilities, shortcomings, he didn't know America very well. He was a bit too lofty. He claimed, I'm sure it was false, he never read a newspaper, but or watched television, but I'm sure that's not true. But he did have that sort of a detachment from, say, some successors, Brian Mulroney, a guy who, by the way, is underestimated in terms of his world role, but who was part of the news cycle as an addict, you know, as a different approach.
Tony Blair.
Tony Blair, brilliant, creative, but I will say he had, everybody is sustained by something. And a lot of politicians I've known are sustained by, they got an edge because they have a competitive negative thing, chips in their shoulder. I don't think Blair did. I think he had this all-abiding sort of faith. It was faith in himself, a self-confidence. Partly it was to do with his ability, I think it's a bit like Clinton, to believe he convinced anybody of anything. He was a superb communicator, and he thought broadly. That turned into a bigger, sort of wider faith that I think permitted him to make the terrible misjudgment he made on Iraq. But a very impressive guy, nonetheless, and a very companionable person.
And Putin and Yeltsin.
Yeltsin, a wonderful guy. Yeltsin, look, quite simple. He believed in three things. He believed in the right of people to vote. It was never really put to the test if he would agree to them voting him out of office. He actually won his elections. He believed in the right of people to own private property, and he absolutely believed in free speech. Okay, and in a totalitarian and traumatized society, those were remarkable, fundamental things that sustained what happened in Russia, the good things that happened in Russia. Unfortunately, there were other things about him. He was erratic, and he was not a shining example to Russians of behavior. Putin, in terms of behavior and competence, was exactly the opposite. Unfortunately, he doesn't have, seemingly, that fundamental, basic grounding of simple democratic principles that Yeltsin had. And you have to judge which is the more important. The excesses and the social dislocation that followed Yeltsin made Putin's competence and tough guy approach, law and order and security and the hierarchy of needs, that's at the top, win out. Somehow some middle ground now has got to be found. And maybe it's Medvedev. Maybe we're underestimating this guy. So we'll see.
And Reagan and Clinton.
Well, Reagan is getting reevaluated upwards by everybody because in the end he was lofty, yes, but he, a bit like Yeltsin, though without the erratic behavior, had grounding in basic principles. And those of us, Canadians, for example, thought on the Cold War he was hardline, too hardline, and on some things like Salvador, too hardline. But you know, he was. I did, of course, accompany my leaders in meetings with him, and he was a genuinely endearing leader to whom people paid attention. And on the big messages, you know, tear down that wall, Mr. Gorbachev, or was it Mr. Gorbachev?
Yes, yeah.
Yes. And then on his ability to relate to Gorbachev, the Helsinki summit and stuff, was really quite remarkable. Bill Clinton, gifted, I guess all of us feel disappointed that those gifts didn't have the outcomes that some had hoped for, in part because of his own, malfeasance in a way. He has said recently that it's impossible to be a great president without a war, without a crisis. I don't know if that was it, but he certainly is, as a communicator, enormous. He was the most popular person in the world in his time. And that's what America needs. By the way, it's what I think America's going to get again. So.
One final question, requiring a brief answer because our time is running out. If students were to watch this interview, how would you advise them to prepare for the future?
Well, it's the old joke about how do you get to Carnegie Hall, and it's practice. Malcolm Gladwell's just written this book, that says anything that's done well requires 10,000 hours of preparation. I don't think that it is book learning, institutional course preparation, with all affection and respect for scholarship. I think it is preparation of yourself, your curiosity, your ability to ingest what is out there, and get grounding, to know who you are. I'm not saying you can't be a great neurotic diplomat. Of course you can, but you need grounding on the basic principles of what you're trying to do. I was talking the other day to a guy in Britain who makes a living as he hates the phrase, by the way, but I'll use it, as a brander of countries. And his first message to clients is that, look, you cannot project what you aren't. That you cannot show inauthentically an image that really isn't yours. You can't have waterfalls in your tourism if you don't have waterfalls, but you can't buy an image. It's got to be what you are. And I think that that's true of people going into public service,
On that note, Jeremy, I want to thank you for coming back to Berkeley and lecturing here, and then also being on our program.
I thank you for the opportunity to do this again, 25 years later, and congratulate you for the program itself.
Thank you very much. And thank you very much for joining us for this conversation with history.